Welcome to This Explainer. We're jumping straight into the deep end today, uncovering the historical and geopolitical roots behind that massive, unexpected invasion of Ukraine that totally shocked the world back on February 24th, 2022. I mean, on that single day, European skies saw a level of warfare we literally hadn't witnessed since World War II. Russian forces pushed in from multiple directions, even going right for the capital city, Kyiv. The map of Europe, which had been, pretty carefully held together by political alliances for 70 years, was suddenly being redrawn by brute military force. But to really get why this happened, we have to look past the breaking news and dig into the actual foundation of it all. Now, just to wrap your head around the sheer geographical scale we're dealing with here, the size difference is absolutely staggering. Russia is exactly 27 times larger than Ukraine. 27! It's this massive, sprawling superpower sitting right next door to a fractionally sized nation. Which, of course, brings us to our central mystery. Why is a country of that unbelievable scale so fiercely focused on and seemingly fearful of its much smaller neighbor? Like, why is the Russian president so deeply invested in who Ukraine is friends with? And what does he actually stand to lose if he doesn't keep his influence there? To peel back the layers on this, let's look at part one, a century of history. We need to map out the past events that set all these dominoes in motion. So if we rewind about 100 years, Ukraine was actually under the thumb of the Russian Empire's Romanov dynasty. But in 1917, the Russian Revolution happens, the king is overthrown, and the whole region is thrown into a chaotic civil war. A few years later, in 1922, 13 different republics, including both Russia and Ukraine, were essentially glued together to form the Soviet Union, or the USSR. Flash forward decades later to 1991, the Soviet Union collapses, splitting into 15 independent countries. And that was the pivotal moment Ukraine officially reclaimed its independence and shook off that imposed government. But hold on, during the decades right before that 1991 collapse, specifically following World War II, a 42-year Cold War completely gripped the globe. And this was driven by a super intense ideological divide. On one side, you had the Soviet Union pushing communism. This is a system of state control where the government owns the businesses and distribution is strictly needs-based. On the flip side, you had Western powers like the US championing capitalism, a system all about individual ownership, private companies, and, of course, profit. Neither side ever fired a direct shot at the other, but they relentlessly fought a political war, each trying to make their own system the dominant one for the whole world. All right, let's move to part two, NATO versus Russia, and see how the military alliances born out of that exact standoff basically created our modern borders. So the absolute game changer here is the concept of mutual defense. Back in 1949, when tensions were through the roof, the US and its Western allies formed NATO. The golden rule was pretty simple, actually. An attack on one NATO member meant an attack on all of them, triggering a massive collective counterattack. The Soviet Union saw this giant unified force, and they immediately set up their own version called the Warsaw Pact to protect their borders. So for over 4 decades, both sides just stared each other down, trying to weaken the opponent without starting World War III. But here's where things shift. When the USSR collapsed in 1991, the Warsaw Pact went completely out the window, leaving Russia pretty vulnerable. NATO, on the other hand, it didn't dissolve. It expanded. Over the next 15 years, former Soviet-aligned countries totally flipped sides. In 1999, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary joined up. By 2004, 7 more countries were in. Suddenly, Russia finds itself with NATO forces right on its doorstep. In that specific region, only 3 countries were left outside the alliance: Belarus, Ukraine, and Georgia. And both Ukraine and Georgia were making it very clear they wanted in. And this is where the economics crash right into the geopolitics. For Russia, NATO expanding isn't just a military headache. It is a massive financial threat. Look, Russia is the 3rd biggest producer of oil and gas in the entire world. Their main lifeline to export all those resources to the global market? The Black Sea. Moscow's immediate, terrifying thought was that if Ukraine and Georgia joined NATO, access to that absolutely vital export route could be choked off, or even stopped entirely at a moment's notice. So now that we understand the stakes, let's jump to part 3, the 2013 breaking point. This was the true powder keg moment. This simmering tension finally exploded just over a decade ago. Ukraine had been working toward a deal to join the European Union, but at the 11th hour, the Ukrainian president pulled a total 180. He refused the EU agreement, took a massive financial bailout from Russia instead, and pledged his loyalty there. While the public was outraged, Thousands of Ukrainians flooded the streets demanding the EU deal. The government responded with a violent crackdown, which tragically left over 100 protesters dead. It escalated so fast and so intensely that the Ukrainian president was actually forced to flee the country and run to Russia. The protesters obviously saw this as a massive victory. But Vladimir Putin, he saw the ousting of a pro-Russia president as a huge, unacceptable defeat. And his response was immediate military action. Russian forces moved in and took over the Ukrainian-controlled peninsula sitting right on the Black Sea. And right after that, Russia started heavily backing and supplying armed separatist groups in Donetsk and Luhansk, two regions bordering Russia, supporting their demands to completely break away from Ukraine. Tragically, this was not just some brief skirmish. The conflict in Donetsk and Luhansk dragged on for 8 agonizing years. Because of this localized war, more than 14,000 people lost their lives, and an unbelievable 2 million Ukrainians were forced to pack up and flee their homes. Okay, let's get into part 4, the final escalation. Here's how decades of shifting borders and tensions finally boiled over into the crisis we see today. The final buildup here was fast, and it was undeniably alarming. By November 2021, satellite images were showing millions of Russian troops massing right along the Ukrainian border, running heavy military drills. Then, on February 21, 2022, Putin goes live on TV, officially recognizes Donetsk and Luhansk as independent countries, and sends Russian troops in, calling them peacekeepers. Just 3 days later, February 24th, Putin launches a full-scale, multi-directional invasion across all Ukraine, officially dubbing it a special military operation. Now, just before he pulled the trigger on that invasion, Putin laid down some extremely strict demands to the international community. He demanded that NATO completely halt its expansion in the area and literally roll back its military presence to where it was way back in 1997, basically get far away from the Russian border. Western leaders firmly and immediately said no. They maintained that Ukraine is its own independent country, free to pick its own alliances, and in response to the threat, they actually increased their military presence in the region. The global reaction was swift and frankly historic. World leaders instantly condemned the invasion and slapped Russia with immediate, crippling economic sanctions designed to tank their economy. For the very first time ever, the NATO response force was activated, and the US deployed troops into Eastern Europe. At the same time, we saw these massive anti-war protests erupting all over the world, including thousands of incredibly brave people protesting right in the streets of Russia itself to support Ukraine. But you might be wondering, with all this massive global support for Ukraine, why didn't the US or NATO just step in and directly fight the Russian military? Well, it all comes down to one catastrophic risk. Russia holds the world's largest arsenal of nuclear weapons, and Putin made it crystal clear. If anyone tried to directly interfere with his operation, the consequences would be severe. That nuclear deterrent is the ultimate invisible shield. It's the exact reason the world's response shifted away from a physical fight and into profound economic warfare. So, as we wrap up this explainer, we really have to look at the board as it stands today. We've traced these dominoes from falling kings, through the freezing Cold War, straight into a modern conflict that has totally shattered the illusion of permanent peace in Europe. With crippling economic sanctions squeezing a global superpower and military alliances hardening everywhere, we're left with a massive question to ponder. With a newly redrawn map of Europe, how will the fallout from this historic standoff reshape global security, trade, and our shared future in the decades to come? Thanks for exploring this complex puzzle with me today,